also the consumer as well.
Well, yeah, that could affect things as well. I mean, they'd have to be relatively intensive relative to other factors in purchasing Chinese-produced goods, which I think could be the case. But people don't usually perceive it that way because, yeah, I mean, that's a more complicated model where people have heterogeneous consumption as well as, but the factor price of labor is still going to go down. But if they're relatively exposed to the sorts of things that China is making, then they could benefit as well.
Okay.
So, yeah.
There's no like general equilibrium model for international trade which would incorporate these things, right?
What James was talking about?
Yeah. Something like.
I don't know of any model where different factors have different consumption bundles. No, I don't know of anything. I mean, it's possible that it exists, but I don't know of it. Jim, yeah.
Well, so why aren't, it seems surprising that economists would advocate compensating in this situation, because how is being hurt by free trade different from being hurt by like our prices going up and then?
Well, people just want to buy them off to get them to support the policy.
Mm-hmm. So
that's the idea.
Not like an economic reason.
No. Yeah. So some have used this Stolper-Samuelson theorem, I think, very cleverly to explain the political history of the United Kingdom and Germany. So what they say is that, in the UK, land was the scarce factor, and both capital and labor were abundant. Because it's a tiny little island, so land's really scarce, but there's a ton of capital and there was a lot of workers. That led to an alliance in the Liberal Party between the workers and the capitalists, and led to this very progressive thing that happened in the UK relative to many other parts of Europe. On the other hand, in Germany, right, the land was scarce, and capital was scarce, but labor was abundant. I mean, that's the story that they tell, at least, that there were like tons and tons of workers in Germany and not very much land or capital. And that led to an alliance between the capitalists and the landowners, which we call sort of like Nazism, roughly. So this political scientist tried to explain a whole lot of political history in Europe and other places by thinking about the alliances between different groups that were created by this, by the relative scarcity of different resources.
So
yeah.
What's his name?
I don't know. You can Google it. You can try to figure it out. He's pretty well known. He's at UCLA, I think. Okay. So Adam Smith proposed a very different model of the division of labor. In this model, everyone's the same, but there's economies of scale, and so we can gain by specializing. And the pin factory is a classic example of this. And Krugman applied this to nations and came up with some really interesting ideas based on this. So one is that he said, it's good to live in a big market or city. Why is that, Prashant?
Just because of like a lot of opportunities, and in terms of if you're just good at certain things, then there are more opportunities for you in a bigger market to distribute your other.
Well, everyone's homogeneous here, so no one's good or bad at anything. Why would it be good to be in a big city? Eric?
Just because a big city is a big market and that allows for opportunities of economies of scale rather than a small market.
Yeah, exactly. Like if I go to a big city, I can do something incredibly, incredibly specific, even if I'm not particularly good at that ex ante. And I can get big returns to that because I can be the only producer of that really, really big thing. And when there's a lot of people, you can take advantage of all the economies of scale, and everyone's going to get higher returns. Right? So that's Krugman's model of why we have cities, which is kind of interesting. And so it leads to agglomeration of people. Yeah. Okay. So another thing that he points out is that countries export products which are in high demand at home, which is a little bit strange, right? You would sort of think, especially from any of the other models of trade, you would think if there's a high demand for a product in one place, they should be importing that product because it's going to exhaust all their supplies of that. And yet we often see countries exporting things that they have high demand for. So for example, in Germany, there aren't a lot of pigs, and yet Germany exports tons of sausage, right? Why would that be the case? Does anyone want to explain? Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, that because it's in such high demand, you've already specialized
Yeah.
in it so much. Why not go further and get these export gains?
Yeah, exactly. Once you've already gotten all the way down your economies of scale, it's so cheap for you there that you might. So you can think that beer, which shouldn't particularly be. I mean, why is Germany suited to making beer? There's not a lot of cold water there, which is the main input to making beer, right? Shouldn't Norway and Scandinavia, the Scandinavian countries be making the most beer? But of course not, because the beer industry developed because of the demand in Germany, right? Another example of this is, imagine you grew up as a kid with a sick grandmother. A lot of people like that end up becoming nurses because they got so good at taking care of sick people that they then end up specializing in that. So that was a demand shock that led them to actually supply that service to the market rather than demand it, right? So that has interesting implications for protectionism. So why does that imply that protectionism might be useful? Can anyone? Yeah, Eric.
Well, I mean, naturally, if the production of the good is created by demand at home, then presumably there's demand at home, and so you want to keep the production.
Yeah, so that gives you a reason for wanting, if you force yourself to make something rather than buying it in the market, that's exactly how you become good at that thing, right? And that's so, people talk about protectionism is so terrible, but if you just think about your life intuitively, almost any time you try to learn a skill that you could buy in the market, you stop buying that stuff in the market and you focus on trying to make it yourself, right? Because that gives you an opportunity to both benefit from the good and get better at it, right? But the problem is, what Mellett points out is that you should only do that in the things that you're potentially the best at. Because actually the benefit you get from the market is by taking advantage of the economies of scale in the areas where you're ex ante the best. So that sort of puts together the two theories. And trade can encourage you to do that. Okay, I'm basically out of time. Do people want me to go finish this, or do people have to go? Okay, I'm gonna finish this. Okay, so Ricardo told a different story in which people were inherently different. Some were relatively better at doing some things than others were, and countries specialized in their comparative advantage. Even if one person is better at everything, you focus on your relative strength. And the value of trade is that it allows this type of specialization, right? So this is an elegant theory, I think, that seems to explain some things. So for example, why are there high-tech clusters in Silicon Valley and in Israel? It's because there's universities there, and Jews have a very intellectual culture, and so that's a very good place to specialize in high technology. You have almost all figure skaters are short, whereas almost all ballet dancers are tall. Why is that? If you're short, it's much better to specialize in jumping high. If you're tall, it's much better to specialize in things that require like long extensions of your limbs, right? So even though those are like things that would be attractive to pretty similar people to do, right? So it's difficult to formalize the test for this thing because it's really hard to know what someone's what someone's ability would be in another area that they're not currently doing. I can sort of think to myself that that short person probably wouldn't be great at ballet because it would be hard for them to do all the pointed toe stuff, right? But it's sort of hard to know exactly what it is if we haven't actually seen them, how they would be as a ballet dancer, right? So almost all the applications of this theory come from some intuitive but not really measurable notion that that person or that place wouldn't have been good at other stuff relative to how good it is at this, right? So two natural approaches to deal with this is to A, assume some particular distribution of talents in different areas and use the implications that come out of functional forms to get something out of that. So you could do that with a power law, for example, right? Because we know that a lot of talents follow a power law. And that's followed by papers like Eden and Cordum, 2002, Dave Donaldson's paper in 2010, and so forth. But another interesting approach is to find an area where we actually know what the productivities would be in another area. And the clearest example of this is agriculture. So the UN, a UN group went and measured the productivity of soil in different parts of the world in all different uses, not just the uses that they were doing in it, based on the physical properties of the soil. And so Costino and Donaldson try to use this to actually think about how well comparative advantage predicts agricultural production. So they looked at every tract in the world, and they used this UN stuff to figure out what their productivity was on 17 crops. The theory predicts that all should be devoted to their absolute highest productivity use given the current world prices, right? Whatever use that particular land could be put to that would make it generate the most revenue, the highest cash crop, it should be used for that, right? And they use this to construct a predicted output level for every country. And they ask how well this predicts output that countries actually have. Yeah, go ahead.
They don't consider the fact that you have to invest in the different technologies or different
No.
crops?
So they try to just take the simplest version of comparative advantage, which is a very natural one, right? It's like, but of course, yeah, there's other factors of production. There's, there might be reasons why you want to do a crop you can eat rather than a cash crop and so forth. So the upside of this is that when they put this in logarithmic terms, they do get a significantly positive coefficient 0.2. On the downside, the r squared that they get is 0.06. So what that says is you guys probably learned far more about comparative advantage than about anything else, any other theory of international trade, probably maybe more than any other idea during your economics education. On the other hand, it only predicts, when we put it to data in sort of the most natural way you could possibly put it to data, about 6% of the variation in agriculture in the world. So what that says is Ricardo's theory says something, luckily. It's not completely nothing. But if we were going to devote relative time in courses to different ideas, it probably shouldn't get as much weight as it does. Anyway. And in fact, Costino et al. 2012 says that only 5%, we only get a 5% gain in global welfare from all Ricardian trade that they're able to pick up in the data, which is pretty amazing. It's saying that if that, and that maybe is not so surprising, if we think that trade overall accounts for maybe doubles world welfare, then if it's in proportion to how much of the trade it explains, that sort of makes some sense. So here is pictures of relative wheat to sugarcane production. So we should expect that there's like no sugarcane in the US and lots down in these regions. And in reality, it's not nearly as stark as the theory would predict. OK. Thanks, guys. Sorry I went over.